Hello everyone and welcome back to Real Life of Animals. Today we're diving into a series of real alligator encounters that shook local communities, changed lives forever, and reminded everyone just how thin the line is between safety and the wild. These stories are not fiction, not dramatized, and definitely not exaggerated for entertainment. Every case you'll hear comes from verified reports, eyewitness testimonies, emergency call transcripts, and official wildlife investigations. Across Florida's wetlands and river systems, alligator behavior follows patterns, until it doesn't. Hunters, hikers, families on vacation, even people simply stepping outside their homes. The individuals in today's accounts never expected what was waiting beneath the surface. Yet each of them faced a moment where instinct, fear, and survival collided in the most brutal way imaginable. As you listen, remember, these aren't legends, they aren't rumors, and they're not internet creepypastas. These are real events experienced by real people, many of whom shared their stories in hopes that others would understand just how quickly a calm, quiet moment near the water can turn into a fight for your life. So settle in, turn up the volume, and prepare yourself, because the truth about these encounters is far more intense than anything a writer could invent. Welcome to the world where nature writes the stories, and humans are just witnesses. Story 1. The canals of Lee County more massive than anything he'd ever seen in those waterways. Its eyes, when they broke the surface, were not the placid reflective discs he was used to. They were set low, furious and small against the sweep of a head that looked like a dark, armored log. The jaws closed with a wet clack, and the water around the creature curled and boiled as if stirred by a giant spoon. Mark's first instinct was to shove off and put distance between himself and this impossible size. He kicked the rudder and pumped the oars with animal panic. The canal narrowed as he shot forward, mangrove roots hissing past, the bank a black wall on either side, and once or twice he glanced back to see the shadow following. Not with the lazy slide of an ordinary alligator, but with calculated, sudden bursts of speed that didn't seem to fit the creature's scale. He reached the small wooden dock by his house with adrenaline overriding his sense. He tied the rope with shaking hands and scrambled up the embankment. Twice he looked back. Twice the water pattern changed in a way that made his skin crawl. The wake spread more widely than it should have, a pressure wave that rolled outward like a hand had swept the surface. That night he slept in the kitchen with the lights on, the radio murmuring meaningless things about traffic because silence felt like an accusation. In the days that followed, Mark saw signs. On the banks where raccoons usually left neat paw prints in the mud, there were now deep gouges as if something enormous had dragged itself along the shore. Fishermen found their lines frayed and snapped as if an invisible hand had cut through them. A bait shop owner swore his traps, baited and checked every morning, were being emptied in hours, not by raccoon or otter, but by something that knew how to rip open wire cages without leaving human prints. Word reached the county wildlife officers. They came out on a Monday, uniforms stiff and radios crackling, towing a narrow aluminum skiff. They set out at noon with heat already dragging at the air. The officers were professionals. They'd waded through swamp muck and removed bobcats from attics. They laughed politely at Mark's description until their own eyes met the canals where the silt had been churned into scalloped eddies. They found a patch of bank where a great weight had scrabbled, displacing earth and exposing the pale roots of a cypress tree in a way that made the officers fall silent. Citizens demand answers when things change in their backyards. Threats to livelihood translate into anger fast. A county meeting was called. There were calls for traps, for hunting permits, for a cull. The state biologists urged caution. Large alligators exist, one explained at the meeting, but they usually don't stray from certain behaviors. From the reports, what you're seeing is not normal alligator behavior. This could be a combination of factors, feeding patterns shifting because of construction upriver, a particularly large male displaced by habitat loss, or something we don't understand yet. Mark went back out that night with a torch and a camera. He kept a shadow to the sound of his boots in the muck. The moon was a thin crescent and the canal lay like glass. He heard the water before he saw it, a sliding, then a low rumble that vibrated up through the soles of his shoes. When the head broke the surface, he recorded it, a dark mass moving with the slow, terrifying satisfaction of a thing that knew its own power. He watched the jaw close around a floating log the size of a small car and then felt something touch his ankle. Not a bite, not at first, just a brush. A cold pressure that made him stumble. He ran then with the camera still clicking, tripod knocked over, breath burning his throat. The footage embarrassed him later. It wasn't cinematic so much as chaotic, shaky frames of black water and mottled skin, but the audio captured it, an inhuman, wet tearing, and something that might have been a low keening or a human-like exhalation. The video made it into the hands of a local reporter who had enough followers to make a ripple, and as ripples do in enclosed communities, it became a wave. People stopped using their waterfront docks at dusk. Night fishing trips were canceled. One man who kept a small kayak by his back door found his vessel overturned, shredded from keel to gunwale as though a giant talon had dragged it along the bank. By the third week, the State Department had to get involved in earnest. Biologists with thermal scopes, graduate students with measuring tapes and data pads, a team from a university with a reputation for wildlife forensic science trekked in. Their conclusion the first week was prudence. There was a large alligator, a male perhaps significantly larger than the official record, and its behavior had become aberrant. But as their methods got more refined, their tempers wore thinner. One night, after running a thermal sweep across a section of canal that Mark knew like the curve of his hand, the team leader leaned back in his chair and said, "This heat signature that's not a single animal." They could see it in the monitors, a ribbon of heat wider than any alligator's body, stretching and contracting in a pattern that suggested movement impossible for a single creature. At first, they thought the sensor was faulty. Then they ran parallel runs and corroborated the pattern. The heat map suggested more than a single colossal animal. It implied something that moved in segments, like the submerged coils of a thing that might be composed of multiple heavy parts sliding together, or an animal that could shift shape as it navigated. No known reptilian physiology matched that trace. Scientists will often say, "We don't know," to keep themselves honest, but here, in the humidity and the smell of hauled mud and the small dead things left on the bank, "We don't know" was the closest they had to an answer. The university team proposed a containment strategy. barricade a section of canal and use remote baiting to coax the animals into camera range. They wanted to collect DNA to drag the waters for tissue, scale, anything. Everyone agreed with caveats. Safety first, minimize risk to public. They set up the barriers and the bait and waited. On the third night of baiting, a roar rolled across the canal that had nothing to do with any animal the team had catalogued. It was a sound they felt more than heard. A pressure that seemed to push the steel posts of the barricade inward. Monitors picked up low-frequency vibrations. The cameras whirred on. For minutes, there was only trembling on the feeds. A movement across the water so broad it could have been wind if not for the way the waterline bucked and waves rose with no gust of air to justify them. Then in full view of 3 cameras, the water bulged upward like a lid being lifted and something the size of a van breached, scattering fish and frogs with it like trophies. The footage went viral in a way the team could not have planned. In a culture that lives by images, what could be explained by sound was suddenly framed in pixels. The internet offered two-sided comfort. Some derided it as a well-played hoax, others did not care to call it anything but real. What mattered to the local people was not the theory, but the praxis, their docks, their auxiliary boats, their children playing by the banks. The county instituted a curfew for canals. Buoys were set in warning, signs were posted, "Do not enter waters after dark." For a time, the panic subsided into a brittle resignation. People adapted in the ways small towns do. A few anglers invested in higher fences. One woman placed motion cameras along the edges of her yard and uploaded grainy clips of something that approached at midnight and stopped head above water, peering like a sentinel before sliding silently away. And yet the animal persisted. The university team returned with more sophisticated equipment. Side-scan sonar, underwater remotely operated vehicles, ROVs with cameras and lights, and an array of acoustic sensors designed to pick up subsonic vibrations. The sonar produced echoes no biology textbook had prepared them for. Long, repeated reflective bands stretching through the canal's understructure that suggested an undulating body maybe tens of meters long, if the calibration was correct. The ROV footage was worse in a way that made their jaws lock. A field of milky water pierced with a sudden enormous eye, then a mouth that opened laterally and closed upon a chunk of submerged timber. The alligator theory of a single, absurdly large male began to fray. Speculation is cheap and exhaustive, but when you have pieces of geometry and reality that refuse to assemble into a well-known picture, you begin thinking of possibilities that would once have been dismissed. Could it be a previously undocumented species, a mutated population, an aggregation behavior, several animals forming a living mass to exploit a food source, or something less biological altogether, something that, in the face of human indifference, had learned a new mode of being? The public wanted decisive action. The scientists wanted data. Meanwhile, fishermen continued to vanish at night. Not many, 1 or 2 at first, perhaps a dozen over months, but enough that the whole pattern became grim. The disappearances were not all alike. One man was found days later downstream, his canoe shredded but his body intact save for exhaustion and a look on his face that made rescuers step back. Another was never found. A small dog simply stopped barking one evening. It was later seen drifting belly up in a stagnant backwater. Then, on a humid August night, a professional salvage team contracted by the county to recover a sunken boat radioed that they had something on the tether. The line went taut at a depth inconsistent with the charted bottom. The divers descended amid beams of light. The ROV cameras shivered as they approached what looked like a cavernous dark. The tether snaked and then snagged on something enormous and alive. One of the divers, veteran enough to have seen many strange things, screamed as if struck. The feed broke. When they recovered the tether, it was not mangled like rope, but cut clean and precise, like a slice had been taken through fiber with industrial shears. The boat did not return for a week. When it did, the salvage crew reported a thing they could not otherwise explain. The underside of the vessel had been scraped in wide parallel arcs, as if whatever it was had teeth not in line but staggered across a jaw too long and too irregular for an alligator. From that day forward, the county officials allowed only daytime navigation in designated channels, and all nighttime activities on the water stopped. Tourists were rerouted. Marina owners hired night watchmen. The economy shivered. Yet people continued to whisper, and in the whispering grew stories that made their way to late-night radio shows and eventually to a national podcast that specialized in modern folklore. Callers phoned with their own sightings, strange wakes that cut channels through lily pads without ripples. Lights seen beneath the surface like watchful eyes, strange metallic sounds muffled by distance. This is always the point where rationalists want to remind us of cognitive biases, patternicity, the human mind's hunger for meaning, and they were right to caution restraint. There were plausible explanations for many of the phenomena. Construction upstream altering currents, predator behavior changed by food waste, human misperception, even organized poachers operating at night. But the combination of sonar, ROV footage, and multiple independent eyewitness accounts made a single explanation unsatisfying. The scale and the coordination implied by the data pointed uncomfortably to something that operated by rules the locals were only beginning to grok. Mark never returned to night fishing. He sold his boat to a man who claimed to be immune to fear and left for Texas. But in the years that followed the first reports, Lee County's canals were haunted not just by the physical possibility of danger, but by a cultural memory that refused to let ordinary life return to its casual rhythms. New folklore grew around the banks, the coil being one favored name by teenagers daring each other to row in the daylight just to see if the water would respond. Campfire stories mutated into confessions of "I saw movement" or "we heard a low, impossible bellow." The scientists kept studying, publishing papers that carefully avoided dramatic language while mapping the heat signatures and acoustic anomalies in graphs and tables. They shared some data with the state, and the state in turn allocated funds to monitor the canals continuously. Cameras, night vision rigs, and acoustic buoys dotted the waterways, each one a small witness to the night. For the locals, the story never really ended because living with a possible predator shapes behavior and rumor in equal measure. It makes people cautious when they once were blithe. It makes kids stay indoors after dark and fishermen keep to new habits that feel like compromises. The coil, whatever it was, exacted its own geography upon the county, forcing the map itself to bend around a reality too stubborn to erase. And sometimes at dawn, When the fog lifts thin from the surface and fishermen push out for the morning's first haul, they still find traces. A patch of churned water, a boat with a fresh scratch. The delicate arc of a wake that is too wide for any ordinary animal. They speak of it quietly because speaking loudly invites attention, and because there is an old, urgent wisdom in small towns. Some things are best respected rather than explained. Mark's camera footage remains part of the archive. Scientists revisit it now and then, and on television specials the image flashes and soundtracks swell, while commentators argue about evidence and motive. The truth remains, as it often does, somewhere between the acoustic spectrographs and the memory of a man who once trusted the canals enough to spend his nights on them. In the quiet of his living room, far from the mangroves now, Mark will sometimes, without warning, reach for the radio and listen to static. And the faint pressure of memory will make him uncomfortable in a way that no rational explanation can fully soothe. The canals, meanwhile, keep their own counsel. The water moves on, and every now and then the surface brightens with a shimmer like a breath. People whisper that they hear the coil when the night gets very still. A deep rolling sound that is part animal and part machine and part something else entirely. They keep their children in, and they keep their lights on. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting effect of all. A human habit of watching and listening and remembering that some parts of the world do not belong to us alone. Story 2. The Green Swamp Incident. Florida's Green Swamp has always been a place people avoid after sunset. Even locals who grew up running barefoot along the edges of the wetlands get quiet when the sun dips behind the pines. The swamp is massive, stretching across 5 counties, fed by underground springs and riddled with old cattle trails and forgotten logging roads. It's the kind of place where sound moves strangely, where a snap of a branch can echo like a footstep and a distant splash can feel like it happened right behind you. Deputy Carla Hendricks had been on the sheriff's force for 8 years when the call started. Small things at first: a busted fence, missing livestock, overturned trash bins. Typical rural Florida complaints. But then a rancher southeast of Polk City claimed he saw something longer than his horse trailer glide across the far end of his property at dusk. He said the head looked reptilian, said the back wasn't smooth, said it had ridges but not like an alligator's, more like plates. Carla chalked it up to exaggeration. People in the swamp tell stories the way other families tell jokes. But then came the night of July 14th. A 911 call came in at 1:17 a.m., the audio crackling with static. A man's voice, breathy, panicked, whispering as if afraid something could hear him through the phone. "There's something in the water. It's following me. It's not an alligator. It's not... I don't know what it is." The dispatcher tried to calm him, but the man kept repeating one thing. "It's not swimming. It's walking under the water. I can hear the steps." By the time deputies reached the trailhead, they found only his abandoned kayak wedged in the reeds, dented on one side as if struck or dragged. No sign of the man, no footprints on the muddy bank, no drag marks. Just silence and the faint smell of brackish water. Carla didn't believe in monsters, but she believed in evidence. And the evidence didn't match anything she'd seen in her career. Within a week, 2 more people disappeared near the same stretch of water. One was a biologist conducting a wildlife survey. Her GPS tracker went offline at 2:43 a.m., the last ping showing her in a narrow, stagnant channel. The other was a hunter whose boots were later found 30 yards apart, as if he'd been running so fast he'd lost them mid-stride. The sheriff's department organized a formal search with drones, boats, and K9 units. They swept it for days, but the dogs kept refusing to go near the waterline, whining and planting their paws as if something seeped out from the swamp that their instincts couldn't accept. Then came the footage. A drone operator reviewing the thermal scans noticed a moving heat signature nearly 40 feet long. Not a single body shape, more like multiple connected sections undulating through the marsh. The temperature readings were inconsistent, as if the thing cooled and heated different parts of its body independently. No known reptile does that. When they enhanced the video, they caught a single frame, one clear enough to show the outline of a head rising above the surface. Long, narrow, eyes reflecting the drone's IR camera with a brightness that suggested a membrane, not a typical alligator eye. Carla watched the footage 6 times. Each time her stomach dropped a little more. She found herself driving to the search site at dusk 2 days later. She told herself it was for follow-up investigation, but really she just needed to see it with her own eyes. She parked by the old boardwalk, flashlight in hand, and listened. The swamp was strangely quiet. No frogs, no crickets, no wind, just a low vibration, so faint she felt it in her chest before she heard it. It grew, rhythmic, not splashing, not slithering. Footsteps underwater, 1, 2, 3 measured, heavy, slow. The swamp surface trembled. Water rose in small circles, widening, darkening. Carla stepped back, flashlight shaking, trying to make sense of the shape emerging just beneath the surface. It moved with intention, like a predator accustomed to darkness, one that did not fear being seen. What she mistook for a log shifted. Then an eye opened, large, pale, reflective, too high on the head and too forward-facing for any alligator she knew. The thing exhaled, a deep, resonant release of air that sent ripples across the water. Carla ran. She didn't remember getting back to her cruiser, didn't remember starting the engine. She only remembered the sound, the slow, deliberate steps beneath the water following her, pacing her retreat until her tires hit pavement. The report she filed was clinical, stripped of emotion, reduced to anomalous wildlife movement. But at the bottom, she added a line she couldn't explain. No known animal should have footsteps underwater. The green swamp was closed to the public for months. State officials arrived, set up acoustic sensors, stationed teams with night vision rigs. They recorded things, low-frequency pulses, sonar anomalies, heat signatures inconsistent with any recorded species. But they found no body, no tracks, no remains. Whatever it was, it knew the swamp better than any human. And it knew how to stay unseen. Locals say that if you stand on the boardwalk near Polk City at 3 a.m., you can feel the ground hum. Some claim they hear the steps, others swear they see the water change direction, flowing backward for a moment as if something passes underneath. Carla eventually resigned from the sheriff's office. She moved inland, away from any standing water. But sometimes in the middle of the night, she wakes up from a dream of footsteps, slow, heavy, muffled by water. And she feels that same vibration in her chest. And she knows without a doubt that the swamp still hides something the world is not ready to name. Story 3. The Sawgrass Phantom of Lake Jessup. Lake Jessup, sitting quietly in central Florida, has long been considered one of the most alligator-dense bodies of water in the entire United States. Fishermen joke that you can walk from one bank to the other on their backs. But locals who have lived there for generations don't laugh when someone brings up what they call the sawgrass phantom, a creature rarely seen, but always felt. Most stories about it surface late at night from people who work the lake: airboat guides, night fishermen, wildlife officers. And nearly all of them avoid the northern sawgrass beds where the water grows thick and black, and where even the most fearless gators behave strangely. But the event that pushed the sawgrass phantom legend into national attention happened in September 2019, when a professional wildlife contractor named Evan Mallory was hired to trap and remove nuisance alligators after several pets went missing near the shoreline neighborhood of Sanford Point. Evan was experienced, 15 years of wrestling gators, tracking them, studying their movements. Nothing rattled him. He worked alone even at night, and he preferred it that way. He trusted the animals more than he trusted people. But something about the reports bothered him. The missing pets weren't just taken. They were taken without a sound. No splashing, no dragging, no typical thrashing behavior that gators show when ambushing prey. It was as if they were simply plucked from the shoreline. So Evan set out one humid night just after 2 a.m., launching his flat-bottom boat into the fog that hovered inches above the water. He began toward the sawgrass beds, shining his spotlight along the surface. The lake felt wrongly still. Even the insects were quiet. He radioed back to base at 2:47 a.m. Movement in the grass line, not a gator, too tall. That was the last clear transmission from him. The next 5 minutes of audio became infamous in the local sheriff's department as one of the most disturbing recordings ever captured on a routine wildlife call. First came the sound of splashing, light, measured, like something wading rather than swimming. Then Evan inhaled sharply. "What the hell? That's not..." Static swallowed the rest. His boat was found the next morning lodged crookedly against a cattail bank. The spotlight was still on, aimed at the sawgrass wall. But the boat was empty. Inside were deep gouge marks in the aluminum, almost like claw scoring, except they were too far apart to be from any Florida predator. There were also muddy prints, but not footprints, wide, flat, and shaped like something dragging elongated limbs or appendages through the muck. The official report said, "Unidentified disruption consistent with large wildlife encounter." But off the record, deputies admitted something else. The prints were spaced as though whatever made them was nearly 10 feet tall. For weeks afterward, fishermen avoided Lake Jessup altogether. Even the bravest airboat captains refused to go near the northern sawgrass channel after dark. One man who lived near the lake claimed he saw something at dawn a week after Evan's disappearance. He said the creature stood half submerged in the grass, its spine rising out of the water like a row of uneven ridges. He described the head as narrow and vertical, almost like a spear tip, and its movements disturbingly smooth, like it wasn't walking, but gliding. He refused to give an official statement. Instead, he moved his family inland the next month. Wildlife experts were brought in, and they attempted to approach the sawgrass area by boat. Halfway through the survey, every alligator within 100 yards suddenly dove at once, sending a massive ripple across the surface. One of the biologists described it as a fleeing behavior I've never witnessed before, like they were trying to get away from something beneath them. and then came the sound. No one could pinpoint its source, but multiple team members heard a long, low-frequency hum. So deep it was felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. It pulsed once, twice, then grew louder as if something massive was exhaling from below. The team retreated immediately. The footage captured that night showed water shifting in unnatural patterns, waves moving toward the sawgrass wall instead of away from it, pulled inward like something underneath was drawing the lake toward itself. After that, the investigation quietly ended. The official explanation blamed territorial alligator activity. But no one who heard that hum believed it. To this day, those who live around Lake Jesup swear the sawgrass beds are haunted, not by spirits but by something ancient, something that moves in silence, something that hunts without thrashing or noise, sliding beneath the water like a shadow with weight. Some nights around 3 a.m., people claim they see the grass part as if something tall shifts through it. Others hear that same bass-deep vibration echo through their floorboards when the lake lies still. And every few months, someone walking their dog near the shoreline reports a sudden quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin, followed by the heavy sound of water displacing, like something enormous rising just beneath the surface. Evan Mallory was never found, not even a scrap of his gear. The lake swallowed him cleanly, as if whatever took him understood how to erase its presence. Locals still warn visitors, if the water goes silent on Lake Jesup, go home. Don't wait to see why. Story 4. The Night the Marsh Stared Back. Okeechobee Wildlife Management Area, 2017. The marshlands around Lake Okeechobee stretch endlessly, a maze of reeds, sawgrass, blackwater canals, and mudflats that swallow footprints within minutes. Locals know the area is both beautiful and unforgiving. It's the kind of place where you can be standing on seemingly solid ground 1 second and sinking to your waist the next. Wildlife photographer Liam Carter understood that better than most. He had spent nearly a decade documenting Florida's reptiles, and he thought he'd seen everything the marsh could offer. But the night of June 14th, 2017, the night he set out to capture rare footage of nesting alligators under a full moon, would be the last time he ever entered the wetlands. Liam planned the shoot carefully. The moon was bright, the weather calm, and the humidity low enough that his camera wouldn't fog. He parked his truck at the access gate, hiked nearly a mile into the management area, and reached a patch of high ground overlooking a shallow marsh bed. He unpacked his tripod, checked the battery levels, and waited for the movement he knew would come. Alligators become bolder at night, more curious, more active. He expected glowing eyes, slow ripples, maybe even a territorial display. But something felt off from the beginning. Normally, the marsh buzzes with life after sunset. Insects, frogs, distant bird calls. But that night, silence. Thick, heavy, almost smothering silence. The kind that makes the air feel too still, as if the land itself is holding its breath. At 11:42 p.m., Liam pressed record. His first journaled note, written by hand the next morning before his disappearance, read, "The marsh feels like it's watching me." He wasn't wrong. Not long after he started filming, small ripples began forming in the water directly in front of him. Not gator ripples. Those are slow, drifting, almost graceful. These were tight circles, as if something was rising straight up beneath the surface. Then came the eyes. Not one pair, not two, dozens. But they weren't spaced like a group of alligators. They were too close together, too synchronized in height, perfectly leveled above the waterline. They watched him in total stillness. Liam whispered into the camera, "They're not blinking." He zoomed in. The footage, later recovered from the damaged SD card, showed something strange. The reflected eyeshine wasn't the typical red, yellow, or orange glow of a gata retina. It was pale white, almost silver, and the eyes moved in unison, tilting slightly left, then right, as if they were not individual animals, but part of a single body shifting beneath the water. At 11:58 p.m., the eyes vanished all at once, not by sinking under the water, but as if something massive had turned its head away. The water stilled, the ripples faded, then the ground beneath Liam vibrated. He described it in his notebook as a slow, heavy thud, like a heartbeat coming from the mud. The vibration pulsed through the soil, traveled up the tripod legs, and rattled the camera casing. He panicked. He grabbed his gear and started backing up toward the access trail. But the marsh moved with him. Every step he took, the mud behind him shifted. Not like something was following, but like something enormous was changing position beneath the surface, adjusting, tracking him without breaking the top of the water. Then came the breathing, wet, guttural, drawn out like air being sucked through a massive cavity. And it wasn't coming from in front of him. It was coming from below. Liam's final journal entry scrawled in rushed handwriting. The marsh is hollow, something inside it is waking up. He broke into a run, stumbling through brush and cattail clusters. His boots were sucked into the mud. He tore them free, losing one. He didn't stop. The breathing grew louder, more strained, like something was forcing its lungs to function after a long sleep. At 12:07 a.m., he made a frantic call to a friend. Only 11 seconds were recorded. "Something's under me, in the marsh, huge, watching." A splash drowned out the rest. When officers located his last GPS ping, they found his camera submerged in only 2 feet of water. But the tripod was bent almost in half, as if crushed by a tremendous weight. His backpack was discovered 20 yards away, shredded. Not bitten, shredded, sliced by something sharp enough to cut through nylon in a single swipe. Liam was never found. The only physical clue was the marsh bed beneath where he stood. The mud was compressed into a perfect circular depression nearly 14 feet across. Biologists could not agree on what made it. No known Florida species creates an imprint of that size. Locals quietly offer another explanation. The marsh wasn't empty that night. It was opening its eye. Ever since Liam vanished, nighttime activity in that area has changed. Airboat drivers report long, serpentine shapes gliding just beneath the surface, too large to be alligators. Some claim to see pale, shimmering glints in the darkness like clusters of eyes rising in unison. One ranger refuses to patrol that section of Okeechobee after midnight. He told his supervisor, "The mud looks like it breathes. I'm not stepping on anything that's alive beneath my feet." To this day, tourists who wander too far off the boardwalk sometimes report that same sensation Liam described. The unsettling feeling that the marsh is watching them, predicting their path, waiting for them to step where the ground is thinnest. And on certain nights, when the water is perfectly still, the pale eyes return, not spread out, not scattered. Clustered together, moving as one, watching. Story 5. Full-length version. Florida's Halobend Marsh was the kind of place locals avoided after dark. The tall reeds swallowed sound and the water lay black and heavy, reflecting nothing, not even moonlight. On a humid July evening, a wildlife researcher named Daniel Morrow radioed his team to say he was taking one last sweep along a restricted trail. He knew these wetlands better than anyone, and yet as the hours passed, Daniel never checked in again. The following morning at first light, a search team moved into the marsh. The air was unnaturally still, as though the swamp itself was waiting for something. The reeds stood in rigid silence, and even the birds refused to call. After 20 minutes of walking, the team found Daniel's abandoned field pack hanging from a branch, perfectly balanced, as if placed there by someone with deliberate, steady hands. Not a single strap was torn or snagged. Beside the pack, the mud told a more disturbing story. A single trail of footprints led toward the water, but none returned. Stranger still, the footprints were too evenly spaced, almost mechanical, as if Daniel had walked in perfect precision, step by step, without hesitation. The path ended abruptly at the shoreline. No splash marks, no dragging signs, not even a shift in the sand. It was as though he had simply stepped into the water willingly. Then the team noticed the indentations. Just to the right of the footprints, the earth was pressed down by something heavy. 4 impressions, wide and deep, spaced like the stance of a massive reptile. But they weren't alligator tracks. They were too far apart, too symmetrical, and each one ended in a clean, sharp curve like the imprint of a claw that had been pressed, not dragged. Before they could analyze them, a low vibration traveled through the ground. The reeds trembled, ripples expanded slowly from the center of the marsh, despite the fact that nothing, absolutely nothing, was moving on the surface. A ranger whispered that it felt like something enormous was shifting beneath the mud, deeper than any known gator burrow. 40 meters away, a cluster of bubbles erupted. The water churned, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate force, as if something was rising just enough to observe them, testing their presence. The oily surface parted for a moment, revealing a pale flash of scaled hide, far larger than any gator native to the region. It glided horizontally with unnatural smoothness, leaving a long, silent wake behind it. One rookie ranger stepped forward to get a closer look until he saw the object floating near the reeds. Daniel's flashlight. The same flashlight he had clipped tightly to his vest before entering the marsh. But what chilled the team wasn't that it was floating, it was turned off. Daniel never turned it off in the field. He had told them countless times, light is your lifeline out here. Someone or something had turned it off after he vanished. Then came the final discovery. On a fallen cypress log about half a meter above the waterline, they found drag marks, parallel grooves carved into the wood. The spacing between the grooves suggested an enormous jaw structure, but the marks were too clean, too methodical, not the chaotic tearing typical of an alligator attack. As if whatever had gripped the log had done so calmly, almost thoughtfully. Local Seminole elders, upon hearing the description, refused to enter the marsh. One of them simply said, "Oh, that place has a guardian. Not all guardians protect." Daniel Morrow's body was never recovered, but the restricted trail he walked that night remains closed. because whatever moved through that marsh wasn't hunting for food. It was hunting for silence, for territory, and maybe for anyone who walked too confidently into the wrong part of the water. Story 6. The shallows beneath Black Cypress Bay. The locals called it Black Cypress Bay, a stretch of swamp on the western edge of the Everglades where the water turned the color of old coffee and the trees leaned inward like eavesdroppers. Even rangers avoided going deeper than the first bend after dusk, not because of superstition, but because the ecosystem there was unpredictable, deceptive, and unforgiving. It was the kind of place where you could be standing in chest-deep water and suddenly realize the bottom had silently vanished beneath you. It was also the kind of place where alligators grew larger than what was considered biologically typical. Creatures adapted to darkness, fed by an ecosystem that hid far more than it revealed. The incident involving the surveyor Daniel Price would become one of the Bay's most whispered stories. He wasn't a tourist, not a reckless thrill seeker, not someone who misread the land. He was a contract hydrologist whose job was to install a new series of water-level sensors. A professional, an expert, a man who had spent his entire career studying the movement of water through difficult terrain. But nothing in his training prepared him for the way Black Cypress Bay swallowed sound, patience, and reason, turning every calculation into guesswork and every safe step into potential disaster. Daniel had arrived early that morning with 2 assistants, Rowan and Harris. They'd offloaded equipment, checked their GPS waypoints, and set off toward a remote cypress stand that required a manual installation. The job should have taken 4 hours. By sunset, they were still in the water, moving more slowly than they ever had, because the terrain had turned into a maze of submerged roots and deceptive channels. Rowan was the first to voice concern. "Light's dropping too fast," he had said, watching mosquitoes swarm like dust in the dying sun. "We need to call it and come back tomorrow." But Daniel had insisted. "The weather's turning on Friday. If we don't finish today, we'll lose the whole week." Reluctantly, they pressed deeper, the water rising from knee-height to waist-height, then higher. By the time they reached the old cypress cluster, the sun was already sinking into the canopy, turning the bay into a murky silver-black mirror. The placement took less than 20 minutes, but those minutes cost them precious light. Rowan glanced over his shoulder more than once, swearing he'd seen movement. A dark ridge cutting the surface 50 yards away, too smooth to be driftwood. They began the return journey in near darkness. That was when everything began to unravel. The first sign was the silence. Not the natural hush of evening, but something deeper, as if the swamp itself had drawn a breath and refused to let it go. Harris stopped mid-step, shining his headlamp across the water. "You hear that?" he whispered. No insects, no birds, not even the distant bellow of bull alligators, just the sound of ripples touching roots. Daniel tried to anchor them with rationality. "Cold front must be shifting the activity," he said. But the swamp wasn't cold. It was suffocatingly warm. They continued, but the silence pressed in harder. Their lights revealed little. Just the gleam of black water and the skeletal shapes of trees. But it was enough to see the first ripple, a long, low wake gliding parallel to them. "That's not normal," Rowan said. "Gators don't track side by side like that." The wake vanished and reappeared behind them. Harris swung the beam toward the disturbance, but the water was still. "We need to pick up the pace," he muttered. They did, but the swamp moved with them. Something brushed Rowan's leg. He flinched, splashing backward. "Something's down there," he hissed. "It's probably a garfish," Daniel said, though his voice had lost all conviction. "No," Rowan whispered. "That was thick and slow." Then came the first surge, a violent heave of water that rocked them off balance. Something massive displaced the surface 10 yards away, but the light caught only churning ripples. Harris stepped back instinctively, and his foot found nothing. He dropped as if the earth had swallowed him whole. "Harris!" Daniel lunged and caught him under the shoulder, hauling him up before the water could take him. Harris gasped, sputtering, eyes wide with terror. "Something brushed my foot, thick like a log, but moving." The water trembled again. Daniel made the call. "We're moving now." But the bay didn't let them go. The next surge came from behind, so sudden and forceful that both Rowan and Harris were knocked forward, splashing into the shallows. Daniel spun, shining his headlamp across the rippling surface. That was when he saw it. Two reflections low to the waterline, glowing a dull, predatory orange. Eyes, massive, spaced wide apart, unmoving. The head rose next, a broad, armored skull pushing the water aside like a prow. It was the largest alligator Daniel had ever seen, twice the length of the ones typically documented in the Everglades. Its back ridges were thick, irregular, gnarled like the bark of the cypress trees, blending perfectly with the black water until it chose to reveal itself. It didn't lunge immediately. It watched, measured, calculated. Predators of that size didn't expend energy unless they were certain. "Don't run," Daniel whispered, "and don't splash, just move slowly." But fear has gravity, and Rowan was already losing control. He moved too fast, stumbled, splashed hard. The alligator's massive body shifted, its jawline breaking the surface with a wet, deliberate hiss. It was deciding. Rowan's panicked breathing became the trigger. The water exploded. The gator surged forward with terrifying speed. Not the sluggish, lumbering attack people imagine, but a torpedo of muscle and prehistoric instinct. Daniel grabbed Rowan's vest and yanked him sideways just as the jaws snapped shut where his torso had been a heartbeat before. The impact sent a shockwave through the water. "Move!" Daniel shouted. They staggered toward the higher ground, but the gator pivoted with unnatural agility, tracking them, staying low but close. Its tail swept beneath the surface, stirring a vortex that hampered their footing. 4 steps later, Harris cried out, a sharp, primal sound. Daniel spun and saw the water behind Harris erupt again. The gator's massive tail whipped through the shallows, catching Harris across the legs. He crashed forward, disappearing completely beneath the surface. "Harris!" Daniel plunged after him, but the water boiled with movement. A shape thrashed below the murk, then vanished deeper, dragged by an impossible force. Daniel's hands closed only on water. Rowan froze, horror displacing any survival instinct. "He's gone," he whispered. "No!" Daniel snapped, grabbing him by the vest. "We don't leave anyone." But the swamp made the rules. The next attack didn't come from behind. It came from ahead. Another ripple, another low gliding wake. There was more than one. Daniel realized the truth too late. Black Cypress Bay wasn't home to a single oversized alligator. It was home to a cluster of hyper-territorial giants, apex predators shaped by isolation, food scarcity, and decades of zero human presence. They were coordinated, watching, waiting. Rowan's panic broke completely. He turned and bolted toward the nearest patch of dry land, sprinting through waist-deep water. The movement drew the second gator instantly. It lunged from the side, jaws wide. Rowan never even had time to scream. The water folded around him in a single violent motion, and then his headlamp vanished beneath the surface, light flickering out like a dying star. Daniel was alone. The swamp fell silent again. He didn't run. He didn't splash. He backed away slowly, breath shaking, eyes scanning the surface for any ripple that didn't match his own movement. The gators tracked him, their eyes breaking the waterline at intervals. Sometimes ahead of him, sometimes to the side. They were funneling him, herding him. But Daniel knew the terrain better than most. He remembered a narrow ridge of submerged limestone 30 yards to his left, a natural rise that cut across the swamp like a spine. If he could reach it without drawing too much attention, he might have a chance. He moved, slow, controlled, predictable. The shapes in the water mirrored him, but didn't strike, not until he reached the ridge and began climbing out of the deeper channel. The largest gator surged again, mouth gaping, aiming for his thigh. Daniel leaped onto the limestone, scrambling forward as teeth snapped shut inches from his boot. The gator thrashed, frustrated, its massive body scraping against the rock with a sound like grinding metal. Daniel ran. He didn't stop until the swamp gave way to firmer ground, until tree line turned to trail, until headlights from the distant ranger station cut through the darkness. Only then did his legs give out beneath him. He survived. Rowan and Harris did not. The recovery teams never found their remains. The bay kept them as it kept many things. Rangers placed new warning signs, restricted access, recharted the deepest channels. But locals still say that if you stand at the edge of Black Cypress Bay on a quiet night, you can see the water shift in long, deliberate patterns, too large, too controlled to be wind or tide. Predators shaped by the dark, survivors of an ancient lineage, and patient guardians of a territory that does not forgive trespass. In Story 7, the Everglades Blood Current, deep inside the southern Everglades where the sawgrass stretches endlessly and the sky looks swallowed by humidity, airboat operator Calvin Rourke lived a quiet, predictable life. For nearly 15 years, he transported tourists through the marsh, pointing out alligators sunning along the banks, osprey nests hidden in the mangroves, and the strange shimmering patches of water where the mud bubbled as if something ancient breathed beneath it. Calvin wasn't superstitious, but he respected the swamp. He never worked after sunset. He never traveled beyond Marker 19. And he never ever approached the dark water corridor known locally as Redmond's Pass, a place the Miccosukee tribe had long warned outsiders to avoid. They said the water there had a memory, one that didn't welcome strangers. On a humid September afternoon, Calvin received a private request, a solo charter for a wildlife researcher named Dr. Elise Carmody. She claimed she was tracking unusual movement patterns from tagged alligators and needed to travel farther west, near the border of Redmond's Pass. Calvin initially refused, but the pay was triple his usual rate. Against his instincts, he agreed. The trip began normally. Heat rippled across the surface of the swamp. Dragonflies buzzed like tiny, restless engines. Calvin maneuvered the airboat through tight clusters of mangroves while Dr. Carmody checked her tracking device. She looked uneasy. Every few minutes, she recalibrated the screen, frowning. "They're moving strangely," she said. "All of them. Like something pushed them out of their territory." Calvin shrugged. "Gators shift around happens." "No," she replied. "Not like this." As they approached the mouth of Redmond's Pass, the water darkened dramatically, an almost maroon tint, thick, oily. The boat slowed as if the current itself resisted their entry. Calvin's chest tightened. "We shouldn't be here," he growled. "The water's wrong." But before he could turn back, the airboat lurched violently. Beneath them, something enormous slammed the undercarriage with the weight of a speeding truck. Dr. Carmody fell onto the deck, the tracking device skidding across the metal floor. Another impact, then another. The water began to churn, slow, deliberate spirals that widened into a vortex. Beneath the surface, a massive shadow circled. Calvin grabbed the throttle, but the engine sputtered, coughing smoke. A submerged force held them in place, like a giant hand pressing upward against the boat. Dr. Carmody scrambled to her knees, staring over the edge. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's not just one alligator. That's a whole cluster." A cluster, but not natural. Hundreds of alligators, bodies half submerged, swam in a tight, unnatural formation. Their snouts barely broke the surface, eyes fixed on the airboat. They weren't posturing, they weren't defending territory, they were waiting. Calvin's skin crawled. "They don't do that. They never do that." Suddenly, the water erupted. One of the gators launched upward, far higher than any alligator should. It slammed onto the side of the airboat, jaws snapping at Dr. Carmody's leg. Calvin pulled her back just in time, but the animal thrashed so violently the entire boat tipped. More gators surged from beneath, striking the hull with terrifying precision, coordinated like wolves. "Move!" Calvin roared, kicking the attacking gator off the deck. The hull scraped violently against something sharp and metallic. Calvin glanced down, then froze. Rusty rebar. Dozens of twisted steel rods jutted upward from the riverbed like skeletal fingers. It was the remains of an old research station that sank during a hurricane decades ago. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Strapped to the rebar were alligators. Dead ones. Dozens. Their bodies decomposing underwater, bones calcified into the steel. Like someone, or something, had pinned them there deliberately. The cluster of living gators erupted again, smashing against the boat. Dr. Carmody screamed as another gator clamped onto the railing, its jaws grinding metal. Calvin grabbed the emergency flare gun and fired into the water. A bright red streak sizzled across the surface. The reaction was instantaneous. The water didn't ripple, it recoiled, as if the swamp itself was alive and hated the intrusion. The entire cluster of alligators dove simultaneously, disappearing into the blackness below. A strange groaning sound echoed from the depths, low, resonant, almost like a long exhale. Then the current began to pull, strong, unnatural. A backward flow that dragged the boat toward the rebar graveyard. Calvin fought the controls while Dr. Carmody clung to the hull, her knuckles white. The current intensified, pulling them sideways, twisting the boat toward the sunken steel. Metal scraped against metal. The boat tilted. And then a giant shape rose beneath them. Not an alligator, not a cluster, something bigger. Something that had been living among the dead. A pale, massive form, scarred, blind-looking, too large for the narrow pass, heaved upward from the depths, its back scraping the underside of the airboat. Calvin didn't know what it was. No textbook creature moved like that. No known animal pulsed with that slow, rhythmic motion. The water boiled around it as the thing twisted, dragging the gator corpses loose from the rebar. It wasn't attacking, it was feeding. The water around them turned red. Calvin didn't think. He slammed the throttle again and again until the engine roared to life. The boat lurched forward, breaking free of the current. Dr. Carmody held on, screaming as they raced out of Redmond's Pass, water slamming the hull like fists. They didn't stop until they reached open channels and normal, clear water. Only then did the swamp return to silence. Dr. Carmody stared back toward the dark corridor, trembling. That wasn't any species we know," she whispered. Calvin looked at her, his voice hollow. "That wasn't meant to be found. They filed no report. They told no officials, but neither of them ever entered the Everglades again. And late at night, when the water is calm and the wind stops moving, airboat captains claim you can still hear it. Something enormous shifting beneath Redmond's Pass. Something that waits and remembers." Story 8. The Swamp That Swallowed Midnight. In the western edges of Florida's Big Cypress Preserve, the nights behave differently from the rest of the state. There is a thickness in the air, a heaviness that presses against the skin, and an unsettling silence that suggests the wildlife is listening to something humans cannot hear. Locals often say the swamp sleeps lightly, as if it dreams with one eye open. On a moonless night in early July, wildlife photographer Miles Rennick parked his pickup alongside a maintenance road leading to an old fire tower. His plan was simple: capture rare nocturnal shots of the preserve's apex predators, panthers, owls, and of course alligators. But Miles wasn't just any photographer. He had spent years chasing storms, crawling through forests and camping in extreme conditions. Nothing scared him anymore, or at least that's what he believed. His main target was a specific alligator, one the rangers referred to as Old Thornback, a massive scarred male rumored to be over 14 feet long. Thornback had been seen dragging deer underwater with shocking ease. Miles wanted the perfect shot for a magazine cover, the beast emerging from black water at night. He set out just before midnight, walking along a narrow trail lit only by his headlamp. The swamp was alive with soft clicking sounds like hundreds of tiny claws tapping against bark. The air smelled of wet leaves and old mud. After 20 minutes, he reached a boardwalk that extended over a shallow marsh. Beneath him, thousands of tadpoles wriggled through the water like spilled ink. A gentle ripple moved across the surface, and Miles froze. At first, he thought it was wind until he noticed the trees weren't moving. The ripple was coming toward him. Slow, purposeful. He raised his camera and zoomed in. No eyes reflected back. No snout broke the water. Just darkness. Gliding. Miles stayed still, waiting. But the ripple stopped just below the boardwalk, then vanished. He exhaled shakily. "Probably a gar," he whispered to himself. He continued onward until he reached a small platform designed for bird watchers. From here, the swamp stretched endlessly in every direction. A soft mist drifted across the surface, illuminated by moonlight that filtered through the clouds. Miles set up his tripod, calibrated the shutter speed, and activated the remote flash. With each test shot, bright white light burst over the swamp, revealing ghostly silhouettes of branches and reeds. On the fourth flash, something appeared in the corner of his frame. A shape, long, ridged, motionless. Miles lowered his camera and peered into the darkness. Beneath the thick veil of mist, he could barely make out the jawline of a massive alligator resting just yards away. A thrill shot through him. "There you are," he whispered. He adjusted the lens, reached for the flash trigger to moment, then stopped. The mist around the gator began to swirl, not from wind but from the creature itself, as if the swamp reacted to its breath. The water around its body rippled in a widening circle, yet the animal didn't move an inch. Miles clicked the trigger. Flash. The gator's head was raised now, eyes open. But something was wrong. Its eyes didn't reflect the typical amber shine. They were dull, clouded, almost milky. Another ripple, stronger this time. Miles stepped back. Flash. Now the gator was closer, at least 2 feet closer, yet he hadn't heard it move at all. No splash, no sliding sound, just repositioned. A cold sensation crept down his spine. He aimed the camera again, but hesitated. Something deep within his instinct screamed that the swamp was too quiet. Even the insects had stopped buzzing. The humidity felt suffocating, almost pressing him toward the railing. Then he noticed it. The water wasn't just rippling, it was rising. Not like a wave, not like a tide, more like something enormous was pushing upward from beneath the entire surface, lifting the marsh in a slow, dreadful swell. Miles backed away so hard he nearly tripped over his equipment. The gator, thornback or not, began to slide forward, drifting on the water without moving its legs. Its pale eyes locked onto him with a dull, lifeless stare. "Nope. No, I'm done," Miles muttered. He grabbed his pack and turned toward the boardwalk, only to stop dead. The mist had thickened into a dense wall. He couldn't see more than a foot ahead. His headlamp reflected back at him like he was shining it into smoke. "Okay. Stay calm." He clicked his radio. Static. He pressed the emergency beacon on his belt. No light. No power. The swamp swallowed the signal. A deep, low vibration hummed through the ground, so low he felt it more than he heard it. The wood beneath his feet trembled. Something was shifting below the surface of the marsh. Something far larger than any reptile. Miles forced himself to move. Each step along the boardwalk sounded too loud, echoing strangely like the swamp was amplifying the noise. Behind him, he heard water dragging slow and heavy, as if a massive shape was following in perfect silence except for the displacement of the swamp itself. Halfway across the boardwalk, the fog abruptly cleared. Miles gasped. The trail ahead was gone, completely vanished. The boardwalk ended abruptly in broken planks as if torn away by brute force. What remained was open swamp, black and endless. He turned around. The fog behind him glowed faintly, pale, swirling, alive-looking. And through it, a massive silhouette stood on the platform where he had been minutes earlier. It wasn't the alligator. It was something larger, much larger. A hunched, hulking form, dripping with water and mud, its outline shifting as though its skin didn't quite stay still. Its presence pulled the mist toward it, forming a spiraling curtain. Miles didn't hesitate. He jumped into the swamp. The shock of cold water stole his breath, but he forced himself forward, kicking furiously to reach a dry bank he could barely see. Plants wrapped around his ankles. Mud sucked at his legs. Something brushed past him twice, large, smooth, purposeful. He didn't look back. He exploded out of the water and onto the muddy shore, crawling until he could stand. He sprinted toward the fire road, lungs burning. When he finally reached his truck, covered in muck and shaking violently, he slammed the door, locked it, and turned the engine. The headlights illuminated the maintenance road ahead. And there, halfway down the road, just barely visible through the thinning fog, stood a single massive silhouette, unmoving, watching. Miles hit the gas and didn't stop until he reached the nearest ranger station, where he filed no formal report, handed over none of his photos, and described only dangerous wildlife activity. But privately, he told the rangers something else. That thing in the swamp, whatever it wasn't hunting me. It was hurting me, pushing me away. Like the swamp was trying to protect something deeper inside. The rangers said nothing, but one of them quietly locked the door, lowered his voice, and whispered, "People think the Everglades are just water and trees. But the truth is, this place grows things it doesn't want outsiders to see." Miles stopped photographing wildlife forever, and to this day the boardwalk he used that night remains closed, officially due to storm damage. Unofficially, Sonora rangers still hear heavy footsteps on the platform after midnight.